Thank you, Becky, and a very warm welcome to all of you. I am the Chair of the Board of Governors of York St John, and it's a huge pleasure to be able to welcome you all here this evening. The Institute of Social Justice is one of the most important parts of York St John University, bringing together all sorts of disciplines and important thinking. On my way here today, though, I was reflecting on the fact that we have in this room today 3 significant institutions, all with a history and a background in social justice. And indeed, we're privileged to be in the Diane Wilcox Lecture Theatre. I didn't realise till I got here, Diane, it was named after you, another champion of social justice in this great city. Our speaker today is Paul Kissack from Joseph Rowntree Foundation, an organisation I was privileged to lead for 10 years, since 1904, representing all that is best about social justice and social change in this city and indeed this region. At York St John, which for a very long time has been a beacon of social justice in this area, and convened by our patron, the Archbishop of York, the Church of England in this northern province, for so long also holding the flame of social justice. I don't think we've better place for our second Archbishop's lecture than to have this group of people here together. Archbishop, I'm going to hand over to you.
Julian, thank you so much. Karen, sisters and brothers, it's a real joy to be here, not least to be here in person. I was able to give the inaugural lecture last year, but of course we ended up doing it on Zoom, which was still a joy, but a slightly slightly different kind of experience than being together like this. So it's really good to be here. As you may know, I'm the 98th Archbishop of York. I struck lucky when I went down the shop centre a couple of years ago. Archbishop of York, you know, who would have thought? And so find myself living just down the road at Bishopthorpe Palace, which has been the home to Archbishops of York since 1241. One of the things about living in Bishopthorpe Palace is as you walk about the place, I'm surrounded by portraits of dead archbishops, two still living other than me. And so my predecessors, actually when I became Archbishop, there is a book on the Archbishops of York, I don't recommend it, but I faithfully read it so I could find out a bit about all my 97 predecessors. I took great comfort from the fact that most of them were very ordinary. 1 or 2 saints, 1 or 2 rogues, but mostly just ordinary people trying to do the best they could. However, there are several archbishops who were indeed not only great saints, but astonishing champions of social justice. And one of them, of course, was Archbishop William Temple, who was Archbishop of York between 1929 and 1942. And during that period, whilst not only doing all the things that archbishops are meant to do, he found time to write extensively, particularly on some of the issues that I'm sure we will hear about later. And some of you will be familiar with his really important book, Christianity and Social Order. Because the time he was writing was the darkest and most difficult days of the Second World War. But at such a time, he was one of those visionaries who was asking the really big questions. So, when this war is over, what sort of a nation do we want to be? What sort of a world do we want to build? And although, as you know, he went on to be Archbishop of Canterbury and then died, tragically very young. So he didn't live to see those dreams become a reality. But things that we take for granted today, not least the welfare state, the health service, free school education, a lot of that was dreamed in the house where I now have the privilege to live. So Temple had that rare ability to deal not only with the biggest questions of the day, but also to reflect practically and hopefully about the detail of life and how the lives of ordinary people in our poorest communities could be changed. That sort of task, as Julia has already intimated, is also the task of our universities, and particularly this university and this institute, stepping back in order to ask the big questions that too many people shy away from. That task also belongs to politicians, NGOs, think tanks, and all those who have a role in shaping the policies that impact people's lives. And it is a privilege and a joy for the church and other faith communities to work in partnership with universities and others, so that together we can build those coalitions of goodwill that will bring change to our world. And the questions that face our world and our nation are so huge at the moment that we really must do that in partnership with others, particularly those who share a vision to build a just and fairer world. And of course, here in this part of the world, chief amongst those other organisations is the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. I'm sure you all know, but let me remind you, Joseph Rowntree was a man of faith, a Quaker, an able businessman, yes, but a committed social reformer, interested in the root causes of social problems. Therefore, the foundation that bears his name continues to work with private, public and voluntary sectors, as well as those who live in poverty. And their research, often challenging, and their conclusions holding up a mirror to our nation, yet always charged with a desire and an aspiration that we as a nation can do better. At the core of the Christian faith, and at the core of what both Joseph Rowntree and William Temple were trying to do with many others, was to transform the lives of ordinary people and transform our society so that it is more just, more equitable, more peaceful, more beautiful. So it really is an absolute delight to welcome this evening as our speaker, Paul Kissack, the Chief Executive of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Paul has had a distinguished career in both New Zealand and this country, holding significant responsibilities within the civil service across a wide range of Whitehall portfolios, not least the Treasury, the Cabinet Office, the Department of Environment, Department for Education, and as a Director General working on the national response to the COVID crisis. His background enables him to speak to us this evening with real authority. And Paul, we are really looking forward to what you have to say. Without doubt, as we emerge from the pandemic, the question that Temple asked in the 1940s is the question we must ask today. What kind of nation do we want to be? Do we need a new social settlement, a fresh Beveridge perhaps, wither the welfare state in the second quarter of the 21st century? These and many other questions are perhaps those, Paul, you'll touch on this evening. But we look forward to receiving your wisdom and insight as you address us on the subject, the task before us. Sisters and brothers, please welcome our lecturer this evening, Paul Kissack.
Thank you very much, Archbishop Stephen, for that kind introduction. It's very good to be introduced by very much a live Archbishop rather than a dead Archbishop I'll be talking about later. Thank you as well, Dame Julia, both for the extraordinary work you did at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the work you continue to do on social justice within the civil society sector today. And thank you, Karen, Matthew, and the Institute for the invitation to give the lecture this afternoon. I must admit, I approached this lecture with some trepidation. In my time as a civil servant, I was only ever provided with 2 pieces of advice on public speaking. The first was don't do it. And the second was that if you find yourself in a position where public speaking is unavoidable, make sure that you do not say anything remotely interesting. So having mastered and honed those skills for 20 years, the next 40 minutes could be something of an ordeal for all of us. In 1942, at one of the darkest moments of the Second World War, a report was published that looked ahead to the prospect of constructing a new, more just peacetime Britain. Setting out the principles which should underpin that future, the report concluded with a suggested programme of action, covering education, housing, incomes, health, and other areas of social policy. It ended with a rallying cry: we cannot return to the pre-war situation. When peace returns, action will be inevitable. The report captured the public imagination. Reprinted twice more in the following 6 months, it sold 140,000 copies. This was not, however, that most famous of plans for reconstruction, the government commissioned report by Sir William Beveridge. That document would follow later. This earlier report was a shorter, more personal and spiritual offering, published as a Penguin special edition and entitled Christianity and Social Order. Its author, fittingly for today, was the Archbishop of York, William Temple. Temple, as we've just heard, was a towering figure of social reform in the interwar period, the first person to use the term welfare state in print in 1941. He wrote Christianity and Social Order in the summer and autumn of that year. Shortly after the book's initial publication, he was ordained Archbishop of Canterbury, and he took his social reform message to mass meetings across the land. And through this work, he gained further prominence as one of the prophets of a post-war social order. But he didn't live to see it, dying in 1944. Christianity and Social Order then is part of that broader Beveridge moment, which characterised the early 1940s. The present Archbishop of York has acknowledged William Temple as one of the intellectual drivers behind what became the welfare state, and has noted the wider role of the Church in shaping that post-war consensus. It is, he has strikingly written, probably the last really significant contribution to public life that the Church of England has made. The final chapter of Temple's paper is entitled The Task Before Us. In that title lies a potent question for anybody interested in social justice. What is the task before us? It's a question which always takes on greater urgency at times of crisis, when old worlds seem to be in flux and new worlds possible. The period during which Temple was working was undoubtedly such a time. And after being out of print for many years, Christianity and Social Order was reprinted again in 1976, amid, as Edward Heath noted in his foreword to that edition, another period of doubt and questioning. It feels to me that Britain is at a similar point of doubt and questioning today. Over recent years, we've heard many voices, from archbishops to retired central bankers, calling for a new social contract, a reimagining of Britain. There appears to be a profound sense that as a nation, our collective progress is broken down. And with each new episode of political, economic, or social turmoil, from Brexit to the pandemic to the current cost of living crisis, the calls for radical change grow louder. I don't intend to use this lecture to discuss the main elements of the current malaise. That's well-trodden ground. The common features are depressingly familiar: deepening wealth inequalities, growing numbers of families in destitution, stark geographical inequalities, fracturing communities, the growth of in-work poverty, intergenerational divides, stalling life expectancy, entrenched structural barriers based on race and disability, alarming trends in mental health. If what you take from that is a sense that things are moving in the wrong direction and that we have become stuck as a nation, you're not alone. Nearly 2/3 of Britons believe that the UK is in decline. Astonishingly, over half think today's young people will have a worse life than their parents. The sad reality is that unless things change, they could well be right. It's in that context that calls for a new Beveridge strike such a chord. I welcome these calls. I think a large part of the task before us today is to engage in that deep and challenging work of striking a new settlement. I joined the Joseph Rowntree Foundation in part because I wanted to engage in that deeper work. And I'd like to use this lecture to offer some initial tentative thoughts on how we might set about some elements of that work. But in doing so, I want to be clear that I don't see that deeper, more radical work as an alternative to more urgent or incremental work. Indeed, I'm not sure that incremental change and radical change are opposites. We don't have the luxury of diverting all our efforts to more speculative and longer term work when confronted with the urgency of social injustices today. We must recognise that the task before us is both deep and urgent. And it's vital to acknowledge that we do have the ability to address quickly many of the most acute aspects of social injustice today. We saw this during the early stages of the pandemic, when almost overnight the government increased the basic rate of benefits for millions of families after years of real terms cuts. They chose to make use of the welfare state to relieve suffering, and it worked. 500,000 people across the UK, including 200,000 children, were saved from falling into poverty. Nor should calls for reimagining our social settlement overlook the achievements of today's public services. What they accomplish in health, education, social services and other areas is extraordinary. For millions of people every day, these services are life-changing and life-saving. So in calling for a deeper reimagining, therefore, we need to be careful not to dismiss the current systems of welfare as somehow obsolete. As a society, we can make different choices about how we use them. Policy, even small changes in policy, can make a huge difference. Part of the task before us today, then, is not to tear down the current welfare systems or start afresh, but to redouble efforts to use them more purposefully and ethically in response to the most urgent and acute challenges we face. In that sense, at least, this is, as it always is, a time for urgent and creative patching as much as it is for policy revolution. And yet, looking at the challenges we face today, I do believe we need a more fundamental shift. There is a risk that we spend too much of our energy tinkering with old industrial welfare machines, asking them to do things they'll never be able to do in the face of profound new challenges. After 20 years in the civil service, this was often how I felt. Public services, no matter how good, simply cannot be expected to override the results of an economic model which throws up such deep inequalities as we see today. Many of our welfare services were shaped and designed to deliver time-limited help to address specific acute needs in a period of growing collective prosperity and improving health. Increasingly, though, the challenges we face today are chronic in nature, requiring deeper, ongoing relational help. It's not even clear that what we need to address some of these more chronic challenges are services at all, but something different and more embedded in the fabric of our communities. Similarly, while there is a strong moral and economic case for making the social security system work harder, there will always be limits to what people want or will tolerate through that system. Ultimately, the real prize isn't to have welfare systems that deliver more, but ones that are needed less. The reality is that aspects of our current welfare system have been overtaken. Economic and demographic changes unimagined when Temple and Beveridge were working have shifted the ground beneath our feet. From the bewildering technological changes which disrupt the nature of work, to the transformed position of women and the fast growth in the number of older people. And then, of course, there's the most fundamental challenge of all, our growing realization that as a species, we're rapidly undermining the source of life on our planet. So just as Archbishop Temple, William Beveridge and other pioneers had to reimagine the social order in their own time to reconcile society to the new industrial age, today, our task is to shape another new settlement to cope with a very different era. If our task is framed as a new Beveridge, how are we to understand that idea? Popular mythology focuses on the Beveridge Report as a starting point, the beginning of a new and very different post-war welfare state. That makes sense in a way. After all, the swathes of legislation in the 1940s certainly marked a critical departure. But the way I read it, the Beveridge Report should be seen more as an endpoint than a beginning. This was not about one man sitting down to describe a wholly new world. As the Times noted at the report's publication, for all its broad sweep, it contained no new departure in principle from the development of social policy in Britain during the preceding decades. Beveridge himself described it as a natural development from the past, claiming his proposals sprang out of what had been accomplished in the preceding years, in building up security piece by piece. This was, after all, precisely what he meant by a very British revolution. And that's because the Beveridge Report came at the end of an extraordinary period of social policy development. The first decade or so of the 20th century was a great turning point. from the introduction of old age pensions to a national health insurance scheme, to the state for the first time accepting a degree of responsibility for the challenge of unemployment. All of these measures were then extended and deepened in the interwar period, with the dismantling of much of the old poor laws, together with the arrival of the dole, contributory state pensions, and many new local welfare services. The same period saw the establishment of the Ministry of Health, the expansion of midwifery and health visiting, free school meals and school medical inspections. It saw the first Children's Acts, plus the reorganisation of education with smaller class sizes and raised school leaving ages. And particularly from the 1930s, it saw the building of millions of homes, such that by the Second World War, 10% of households were council tenants, while 1/5 of British manual workers owned their home or had a mortgage. Historian David Edgerton has gone so far as to conclude that Britain went to war in September 1939 with a welfare state already in place. I don't agree with that. Nevertheless, the picture in 1939 was undoubtedly transformed from the beginning of the century. The best recent history of social policy in Temple's time, by York-based historian Chris Rennick, certainly shows how the first 40 years of the century established much of the infrastructure, customs and practices of what became the post-war welfare state. So when I hear people calling for a new Beveridge, I think less about the process of sitting down to write a new detailed blueprint for change, and much more about the hard work that took place during the period leading up to 1942, in which William Temple played his full part. I find myself wondering how we might recapture some of the spirit of that time with its sense of momentum and possibility. This is a particular interest to me today, leading a social change organisation, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Like our founding father, we see our role as supporting and speeding up the transition to a more equitable and just future, free from poverty. There are, of course, many lessons we might draw from that earlier period, but today I'd like to mention just 4 before moving to consider where we might wish them to take us. The first is the importance of insight. For those of us committed to social justice, we must constantly work to deepen our understanding and knowledge of the world before us and ask ourselves the question, what is really going on? The 40 years leading up to the Beveridge report were punctuated by regular studies which shed new light on the scale and nature of poverty, challenging prevailing conceptions and disrupting lazy and prejudiced assumptions. Some of the finest examples were, of course, here in York, thanks to the great Seabohm-Rowntree studies that bookended the period. But there were dozens more, including the Fabian Women's Group's famous 1913 study of life in Lambeth, or Marjorie Spring Rice's Working Class Wives, which reset so much thinking on healthcare. Such studies not only shaped opinion, but often directly shaped policy. William Temple himself understood this power of insight, editing in 1938 an influential study on the impact of unemployment, men without work. As historian Selina Todd has written, these studies also gave unemployed people voices, histories, and individuality. And voice was a second key ingredient to brewing up change. As so often, the social advancement of these years went hand in hand with greater political engagement. This was an age of organised labour, with rapid growth in union membership, and of course, the arrival of the Labour Party as a parliamentary force. The voices of the working class were often loud and angry, and felt not just at the ballot box. People didn't wait for social change, they agitated and campaigned for it. Responding to fresh insights and the many voices for change called forth a third critical ingredient. This was self-consciously a period of experimentation. That word crops up repeatedly in the speeches of leading politicians passing new legislation and remains the spirit of the age in social policy. Beatrice Webb said she found it really quite comic that politicians suddenly engaged in a scramble for new constructive ideas. Practical new proposals were sought at home and abroad. The search tapped into the innovation of local government and charities and foundations, as well as trade unions and friendly societies. Legislation was more often born of pragmatic experimentation than philosophy. Policy responses could be rushed and ad hoc, seeking to respond to pressing challenges. The dole, for example, is often seen as being created almost inadvertently in 1921 as a panicked response to the face of mass unemployment. Without it, William Temple argues, it's hard to see how revolution would have been averted. But there was also a fourth ingredient, which is just as critical to progress. Improvised and incremental as the process might have been, it did entail imagination and hope. There was, in fact, a spirit of adventure to the work. Churchill, at the height of his liberalism, talked of the state embarking on novel and adventurous experiments. Clement Attlee, writing in 1920 as a social worker in the East End of London, talked about the possibilities of adventures for civil servants, no less. Governments took bold steps into the unknown. The Old Age Pensions Act of 1908 was passed by a parliament which had very little sense of what it would actually cost. The ethical imperative pierced the actuarial fog. Hope, imagination, and a sense of adventure, therefore, lay beneath the practical puzzling of specific developments. And while such imagination was alive and well at the national level, it was often most energetic at community level, amongst pioneering local councils, charities, and individuals. One of those individuals, of course, Joseph Rowntree, turned imagination into reality by building a new self-governing community at New Earswick, here in York. This then was the spirit of the age, which led to a reimagining of Britain a century ago, informed by fresh insights, inspired by campaigning voices, acted upon by practical women and men puzzling a way forward through new experiments, and fueled by an imagination and a sense of belief. Nobody knew what the ultimate destination would be. Those doing the work didn't know whether they were patching up and sustaining an old world or ushering in something quite new. But critically, they got on with the work. I should, of course, be careful not to romanticize this period. It was a time of deep economic fear, mass unemployment, inside an increasingly dark international context. But I can't help but find something inspiring in its spirit of possibility. And I think we can draw useful lessons for the task before us today. Because while I welcome calls for new Beveridge, perhaps today we are not at a 1942 moment. Perhaps we're not ready to write a tidy new social settlement. Perhaps we haven't done the work yet to get there. Maybe instead we're closer to a 1932 moment or 1922, still searching for the threads to pull together, feeling our way towards solutions to new challenges. Either way, like the pioneers a century ago, we must get on with the work. But to what end? What is the vision for a more socially just Britain to which we should work today? It's here that I must make my confession. I'm afraid I don't have a clear or detailed blueprint for a reimagined Britain. Indeed, I'm a little wary of anyone who claims they do. One of the lessons I take from the history of Temple and Beveridge's time, however, is that the lack of a clear sense of destination need not prevent progress. It's critical to an understanding of their time to recognise that progress was not the result of following any clear blueprint or pursuing a single vision for a new political economy. Instead, the organic, slightly chaotic, iterative nature of the evolution of social policy was what ultimately allowed a new consensus to emerge and helped to make it stick. Nevertheless, even if there was a lack of a clear destination, a sense of direction was vital. And in Temple's time, much of that sense of direction in social policy sprang from a critical debate between two competing visions of a correct social order: individualism and collectivism. For Temple, as for his contemporaries, this was a preoccupying question. It went to the heart not just of the correct social order, but to the nature of mankind. Temple writes, "It seems scarcely too much to say that neither individualism nor collectivism is compatible with a truly Christian understanding of man or of life. In part, Christianity and social order can be read as an attempt to resolve this dilemma, reconciling the importance of freedom, which Temple saw as the first aim of social progress, with the imperatives of service and social fellowship, Temple's two other Christian social principles. His conclusion is a fine balancing act. The aim of a Christian social order, he states, is the fullest possible development of individual responsibility in the widest and deepest possible fellowship. During Temple's lifetime, as the welfare state was emerging, the balance of the social order tipped gradually but clearly in a more collectivist direction. But in the last 40 years, it has undoubtedly shifted decisively back towards individualism. It is the extent of that shift, I believe, that lies beneath many of our current challenges. This concern can be found at the heart of much contemporary writing and thinking about the state of Britain today and how it might be reimagined. Such thinking is often shot through with a desire to strike a new balance, searching to discover a more collective endeavour. And so my sense is that addressing this question may have an important role to play in unlocking a new social settlement today, just as it did for Temple. To illustrate what I mean, I'd like to cover three areas where I believe the balance has fallen away and we need to take action to restore it. The first is the need to reassert the common good. Central to Temple's view of social justice was creating the conditions in which all people could fulfill their purpose and give expression to their personalities. He called for every family to be housed with decency, every child given the opportunity to fully develop their aptitudes, every citizen secure in an income sufficient to live with dignity and raise a family. This vision of a common good also requires self-discipline and self-sacrifice from individuals. While recognising the importance of people serving themselves and their family, Temple asked that these narrow loyalties be balanced by wider duties to community and nation. As we've seen in Temple's time and afterwards, the state was fast growing in confidence, using new powers to provide greater collective security. After the war, this helped many realise their true potential and fostered a period of greater social mobility. But over the last 40 years, that process has been put into reverse. Risks that were formerly pooled by the state, the community, or by employers have been pushed onto the backs of individuals. In too many ways, we've become a sink or swim society. Deep changes have occurred in the workplace. Greater labour market flexibility has helped to deliver high levels of employment and assisted many, including women, into the workforce. But the flexible workplace has often become a less secure, more precarious place. From the declining role of trades unions to the end of defined benefit pensions, the advent of 0 hours contracts, over decades, we've seen more risk passed on to individual workers. Meanwhile, businesses and investors are encouraged to focus on short-term value for shareholders rather than any deeper purpose or the common good of different stakeholders. In the face of this, we need our institutions of the common good to work harder and in more creative ways, but too often they're shrinking back. Today, we live in a country where the state is at the same time over-centralised and over-mighty, and yet frequently pleads its own helplessness, often leaving families to face risks alone. For those of working age, our social security system no longer provides peace of mind about support in difficult times. We have some of the lowest rates of unemployment benefit and sickness benefit in the rich world. Social housing, for decades critical to a decent and secure life for millions of people, has fallen back dramatically. Since 1980, the social housing stock in England has declined by around 1.4 million homes, while in the last decade, new social housing has virtually ground to a halt. Little wonder that over 1 million families wait on the social housing lists, with more and more families pushed into the poorly regulated private rental sector. Of course, we shouldn't assume that all answers to new challenges lie with the central state. We need to devolve more power and resources to the local level. We also need more humility from government in how it works. But we do need government to be bolder and more determined to ensure these new challenges are met, including with fresh ideas and thinking. Our social security system in particular will need to adapt to an ever more complex world, probably, I would argue, through principles of greater simplicity and universality. We'll also need to develop new approaches to security and collective worker voice for the digital economy. Again, profound challenges requiring fresh insight, experimentation, and imagination. In other areas, rediscovering the wisdom of older approaches may be our best course. A major programme to expand the stock of social housing, for example, is urgently needed, by socialising homes in the secondary market or by building new homes for social rent. Such a programme could be a clear statement of both our commitment to the common good, but also, with the right standards, our needs to meet new environmental challenges. In our own city and region, here in York, it's a challenge which the Joseph Rowntree Housing Trust is committed to, with a plan to build hundreds of new homes for social rent in the years ahead. Whether through new approaches or old, we can't turn our back on the need to reassert the common good. Recent decades have left growing numbers in Britain in insecure work, living in insecure housing, and lacking a social security system that will properly support them through difficult times. For these people living with constant anxiety, the individual freedom to live a purposeful life, the goal of William Temple's social progress, can be a cruel illusion. The second area is the need to share our common wealth. Temple, always a pragmatist, was comfortable with property ownership, even if in Christian teaching it was a compromise with original sin. But he was also clear that wealth was subject at all points to control in the interest of society as a whole. It was, he claimed, a fundamental Christian principle to ensure that all members of the community shared in the enjoyment of some portion. Extraordinarily, at the beginning of the 20th century, the wealthiest 10% of households in Britain owned 90% of all wealth. Then, throughout the period when Temple was active, and through most of what followed in the 20th century, wealth in Britain became more evenly shared. But that progress broke down in the 1980s. Initially, the effect of the breakdown on the dispersal of wealth was concealed by a continuing rise in home ownership. But from the beginning of this century, the rise in home ownership stopped. Rates of owner occupation have collapsed. There are 1.5 million fewer owner-occupying households in England today than would have been the case without that collapse. With it, the soothing idea of an inclusive property-owning democracy has fallen away. Today, the top 10% still hold half of our collective wealth, while the whole of the bottom half of all households hold just 9%. And many families have effectively no savings at all. Meanwhile, as inherited wealth becomes a much more important factor in the resources of young people today than it was for previous generations, a society defined by what you earn is giving way to a society defined by what you or your parents own. If then we are to avoid entrenching a new caste society and instead spread greater security and opportunity, addressing current wealth inequalities is unavoidable. Measures to support assets amongst those with the least, including the youngest, are urgently needed, giving them a new stake in our common wealth. We must also reform the taxation of wealth, from property or pensions, for example, which currently too often reinforces the concentration of that wealth. Meanwhile, though we certainly need to build new homes, we won't build our way to restoring previous levels of home ownership. So we must address the distribution of our nation's current housing, with measures to shrink the rapidly growing private rental sector and instead support greater owner occupation. Beyond the focus on individual and household wealth, we should also welcome a renaissance of interest in older, shared and democratic forms of wealth. Witness the growing interest in community wealth funds, community land trusts and non-standard corporate models, such as mutuals and cooperative businesses. We're also seeing fresh interest in the power rather than the tragedy of the commons, an ancient approach to the collective sharing of wealth, given new life in the age of the internet. All are opportunities for wealth to be broadly held and more locally and democratically grounded. Archbishop Temple would surely have approved, as he reminds us wealth is essentially social. People hold property as a steward and trustee for the community and for the needs of the present and future generations. If that was true in Temple's time, it's doubly so in an age when ecological change is asking deeper questions about human stewardship of the planet. The third and final area I'd point to is the need for us to foster a common life. For Temple, it was only in the myriad local associations, the family, the church, the trade union, the football club, the school, that freedom and individual personality became real. The social nature of people was fundamental to their being. If you take all these social relationships away, he claimed, there is nothing left. The yearning to rediscover this social fellowship is a strong theme across the political spectrum today, whether dressed in the language of social fabric or social capital, of community paradigms or a citizen story. They are all slightly different concepts, no doubt, but they seem to me to have at their heart the same sense that strengthened, empowered communities are vital to a reimagined Britain and to flourishing lives. A reinvigoration of our common life sits at the heart of political renewal. Richer relationships, nurtured by having places to meet, connect, and enjoy community engagement, correlate closely with the sort of political engagement that can spur democratic revival. It sits too in how we might reimagine our approach to welfare to address those longer-term chronic challenges we face. After all, it's in the knowledge, time, and relationships of people in their communities that our greatest resource lies, and in the capacity for ordinary people doing extraordinary things together. The common life may lie too at the heart of our economic renewal. In economic textbooks and so in politics, too often debates have been about the balance of markets and individuals on the one hand and the state on the other. The third pillar of community has often been absent. But strong social networks are not an alternative to functional markets, they're a precondition to them. In short, investment in the social infrastructure of our common life, our parks, libraries, sports clubs, pubs, but most of all in the relationships in which human flourishing occurs, must be foundational to a reimagined Britain. Ultimately, perhaps, this may even provide the key not just to the means, but to the end of our pursuit of social justice. For as William Temple reminds us, it's in the social fellowships we form that the real wealth of human life consists. Together, I think these three areas offer useful questions for us to ask ourselves as we undertake work in pursuit of social justice today. Is our work helping to reassert the common good? Is it helping to share our common wealth? Is it helping to foster a common life? If so, even if we don't know where it might ultimately take us, we should be pushing in the right direction. To be clear, this is not an argument against individualism per se. We should cherish and feel grateful for our individual freedoms and rights, not least as war stalks Europe and shows us once again such rights can never be taken for granted. Nor is it an argument against the accumulation of individual wealth. Still less is it an argument against leading a private as opposed to a common life. I am by nature something of an introvert, so to be told by Archbishop Temple that my personality can only be made whole through human relations in a community is not a pleasing idea. Instead, my plea is to embrace a more balanced, perhaps a more complicated view of ourselves as social beings. Clearly, in today's politics of polarized tweets and raging tribes, the very idea of balance might seem like a tough sell. But I'd argue that getting this particular balance right is central to our task. And so in concluding this evening, I want to argue that if we are going to get there, if we're going to build this more collective endeavor, we must start telling ourselves a different story about who we really are. The individualistic social order we live in today is propped up by many powerful stories, but I believe that two in particular have weighed heavily in the scales. I grew up with both, and they dominated much of the environment in which I helped to make policy as a civil servant. I hear people telling versions of each story almost every day, and there is some truth in both of them, but they are ultimately distorting and impoverishing ideas and stories about who we are individually and collectively. The first is the consumer story. Today, we're encouraged to see ourselves first and foremost as individual consumers. The market is geared not merely to meeting our choices, but to encouraging us to demand ever more. Meeting those demands, including through economic growth, is elevated to an end in itself, the principal definition of human flourishing. And the values underpinning that process are elevated beyond the narrowly economic. We've moved from a market economy to a market society. Taken to this extreme, this is, of course, a narrowing and false story of what it means to be human. Our infinite complexity reduced to Homo economicus. It's a story which pits the interests of humans as consumers against the needs of the planet and reduces people collectively and individually to a purposeless existence of short-term gratification, plagued by addictions and anxieties. Even 80 years ago, Temple was alive to this risk. Nothing is so futile as the unhampered satisfaction of sporadic impulses, he claimed. That is the sort of existence which leads through boredom to suicide. Freedom, so far as it is a treasure, must be a freedom for something, as well as a freedom from something. It must be the actual ability to form and carry out a purpose. Which leads to a second story we tell ourselves today, the story of meritocracy. Encouraging individuals to shape a purposeful and meritorious life is a good thing. Indeed, it sits at the heart of Temple's conception of freedom, to live a life of self-direction. But in our current conception, we've distorted this into a troubling and misleading story. Today, we are encouraged to see ourselves as the individual makers of our own destinies, the heroes of our own life stories. In a very practical sense, in 21st century Britain, this is often quite false. In a society where educational gaps track deep disparities in wealth, and where those in positions of privilege hoard opportunities, it's quite wrong to assume people end up where their intrinsic merits should take them. In any case, the accumulation of merit is not just a product of individual agency. We are all instead shaped by the lottery of our birth and the circumstance of our upbringing. As Temple wrote, each individual is born into a family and a nation. In his maturity, he is very largely what these have made him. The meritocratic story also has invidious consequences. If we're encouraged to believe we arrive at our lot in life principally as a result of our own individual actions and merits, then it follows that we somehow deserve that lot. For those whose particular merits happen to be highly valued by society, this can breed a sense of entitlement and hubris. It can erode their feelings of solidarity and mutual obligation to those deemed less deserving, breeding resentment on both sides. And so the meritocratic story pushes against the idea of the esteem and dignity of all. It masks what Temple's great friend R.H. Tawney described as the belief that every human being is of infinite importance. My appeal is once again for balance. I like being a consumer. I like individual choice. But like others, I want a more shared and purposeful life than the mere satisfaction of my passing day-to-day wants. Similarly, I relish my sense of agency and my ability to determine my own life course. But I should never begin to believe I deserve whatever success I might enjoy. Like everyone else, I'm the product of the accident of my birth, the collective endeavour of the community which raised me, and of what some would call sheer luck, and others would call the grace of God. Justin Welby has written that reimagining Britain requires refinding the deep stories that survive short-term ups and downs. This rings true to me, and I believe that to reimagine our social settlement in Britain today, we need to embrace a deeper and more complicated story about who we really are. A story which sees us not merely as consumers or as the all-powerful agents of our individual destinies, but as infinitely more interesting beings. Embracing that story is at the very heart of Temple's Christianity and social order. He is, he claims, concerned with men as they are, not as they ought to be, not perfectly good, but not utterly bad either. If the idea of embracing this more complex story about ourselves sounds fanciful or even nostalgic, I don't believe it is. A yearning for a more collective endeavour is always just below the surface. And we've seen that these last 2 years. For all its miseries, COVID has undoubtedly helped us catch glimpses of a different story. Every day, for weeks or months on end, sacrifices were made by individuals and families up and down the land in recognition of the greater common good. Workers, previously dismissed as low skill, in care homes, delivery vans, supermarkets, were suddenly afforded new esteem and dignity as the essential heroes of the front line. Meanwhile, the UK's governing regime, which had spent years, even decades, proclaiming its own impotence before the laws of the market, adopted a whatever-it-takes approach in service to the common good. And it was often at the local level, in the common lives of neighbours, that the collective spirit became most evident. Local infrastructure developed quickly and spontaneously, bringing communities together, distributing food, providing help and support. Opinion polls showed a sharp rise in indicators of community strength, often after many years of decline. In short, momentarily, we told ourselves a different, deeper story of who we are. We were cast in a new role, and we played our part fully, because it was in our nature to do so. As Archbishop Temple reminds us, man is self-centered, but he also carries with him abundant proof that this is not the real truth of his nature. So as we approach the task before us, with ambition and imagination, let us tell ourselves that different story. Thank you very much.